During World War II, 97,000 American military personnel were captured by the Germans. 1,100 died in captivity. The Japanese, on the other hand, seized 33,000 American military, and out of this total, a staggering 12,500, more than 40%, died at the hands of their Japanese captors. What isn't known is that hundreds of United States merchant marine seamen, captured after their supply ships had been sunk, have never been counted in these prisoner of war totals. And they would suffer, especially from the Japanese, some of the worst prisoner of war atrocities inflicted on Americans during the war. What happened to them and how they were treated, not only by the Germans and the Japanese, but by their own government, is one of the most disturbing stories to come out of World War II. Why has little or nothing ever been revealed about these merchant marine prisoners of war? Well, now, after more than a half a century, you are about to find out.
When the war broke out, I was on a ship in Portugal. 85% of the ships in the convoy were sunk before we got out of the Caribbean, and they had a big passenger ship just picking up survivors and bringing them back. At that time, there was the Navy or nothing was able to stop the Germans. We were sunk on November 29th, 1942, by the German warship. She told us that our ship went down in about 8 minutes, and the next thing I knew, I was in the water, kicking around, hanging on to a piece of wreckage. How I got in the water, I don't know. I must have been blown in. And then the German warship came along, and they picked me out of the water. They picked 19 of us out of the water.
For the many merchant marine seamen who would survive hundreds of sinkings, their fate as prisoners of war would be lost in the pages of history for more than 50 years.
The average American has no idea that when you lose a ship, and when they give that thing to abandon ship, when they give that order and ring the bell, their pay stops. And then they're in a lifeboat, you don't know how many days or to get before they get some kind of help and safety back to land again.
In February 19th of 43, they turned us over to the Japanese in Singapore. Well, we had a good awakening there. The German doctor gave me a paper because I was shot up real bad, and he said to give it to the Japanese doctor. Well, in Singapore, when we got there, the British interpreter said, "Do we have anything?" I gave him the paper. He gave it to a Japanese sergeant, didn't even look at it, tore it up, and took his sword out and hit me and knocked me down. So I said, well, I know we're in for a rough time now.
Stan Wilner would spend 3 years in Japanese hell camps, in which his weight would drop to only 72 pounds. When the war ended, American military prisoners of war were liberated all over the world. They were sent home on troop and hospital ships, but the merchant marine captives found themselves literally with no way back.
And the story that moved me so much was a man, the captain was just ready to depart, and the chief mate was standing by the gangway ready to raise it up. And here this fella comes along and looked like a homeless bum, but he had no clothes or nothing. And the captain, of course, said, "Hey, who is that? Let's get this thing going and all." And the chief mate went down on the gangway, and this guy was trying to get up the gangway. He couldn't make it. And he said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm a prisoner of war." Can you imagine this man that had to fight his own way home? The captain, God bless him, get him up here. and treated them and took them back home. But this is the kind of thing that we went through, and nobody knows about it.
The United States Merchant Marine delivered the war supplies and paid the price with one of the highest casualty rates of the war, and forgotten as they suffered the brutality of enemy prisoner of war camps.
They were taken, when they died, down to a brick building that they call the mortuary, and they would take everything, all their clothing and everything that could be used, and throw them in like a stack of cordwood. And then when they get a quota, they'd dig a trench, and that was probably the worst duty that I was involved in the whole time.
They were unforgotten. Nobody knows about these men that were in these terrible prisons and that, and what they went through getting before they got in the prison to march 50 miles up a railroad, and if they stopped, they would get hit with a gun butt, and the shipmates held them up. They just carried them along, and I've even heard that they carried the dead with them, because that was their buddies, that was their people that they worked with. And it's such a tragic story. I'm surprised that very few Americans know this.
The government didn't give us anything. They just dumped us.
These were the prisoners of war that America really forgot.
Our story begins in 1933. It was the year Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Overnight, he set about transforming his country into a totalitarian state. He withdrew from the League of Nations, no longer honored the Treaty of Versailles, and quickly rearmed the military. As the free world stood by and did nothing, he reclaimed the Saar, announced Austria now belonged to him, and quietly marched into Czechoslovakia. Then on September 1st, 1939, Hitler turned loose a sudden and devastating attack on Poland. In so doing, he started the greatest war in history. Within a month, Poland fell. Then came Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The stunning quickness of Hitler's war machine alarmed Great Britain and France, both who had entered the conflict obligated by the treaty to defend Poland. In late May of 1940, the German army surrounded and trapped the British at Dunkirk. More than 355,000 British troops escaped annihilation in an epic evacuation. A month later, France surrendered, leaving Great Britain alone to face the inevitable German invasion. But Hitler hesitated. He reasoned he could bring the island nation to its knees with constant heavy airstrikes. Then, with arrogant confidence, he invaded Russia, who had been his ally at the start of the war. Thus began one of the most incredible American convoy of war supplies the world has ever seen. While remaining neutral, the United States had been shipping war supplies to Britain. Now Russia had been added. And the deadly German submarine wolf packs found these defenseless ships easy prey all the way from the east coast of America, across the Atlantic to Great Britain, and up over the icy North Atlantic to Russia. Nearly a year before the United States became involved, American merchant marine seamen were going down in these ill-equipped ships at an unbelievable rate. Some of the merchant mariners who survived in lifeboats were taken prisoners of war by the Germans, facts that were kept from the American public.
2 of them got off, and they clung to an overturned lifeboat for about 5 days, and then they met up with another lifeboat with some of the merchant crew, and they spent 53 days in the North Atlantic in an open lifeboat before they were picked up by a German submarine and brought in to Germany.
Then on a fateful Sunday morning, the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. picked up an astonishing radio dispatch. It simply read, December 7th, 1941, air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. In one quick, devastating attack, the United States Navy presence in the Pacific was paralyzed. Nearly 2,500 American servicemen were killed. The U.S. Navy that morning would lose 3 times as many men as in the Spanish-American War and World War I combined. The surprise raid on Pearl Harbor finally brought the United States into the war, and it united an angry and determined country as no event had done before or since.
The day after Pearl Harbor, I was so motivated that I went down and signed up in the Navy. It so happened that I was talking with some of my ex-school chums, and they thought it was a good idea. We're going to go down, join the Navy, and fight the Japs.
And we marched down Broadway here in Portland with our suitcases, and they were throwing rose petals all over Broadway and wishing us bon voyage. We got on a train that said Tokyo or bust, and Hirohito, here we come.
As more than 15 million men and women went into the armed forces, a staggering 53 million civilians poured into war boom cities to do their part in defense plans. Thousands of men, unable to shoulder arms because they failed their physical or were too old, joined the merchant marine. More ships and men to sail them were desperately needed to get the war supplies to all corners of the world, not only to the American forces, but to the Allies as well. The speed at which merchant ships were built was mind-boggling. One Liberty ship was constructed in less than 5 days, complete with lifeboats, chairs, and bedding. This mass output of ships, war arsenal, and huge quantities of rubber, aluminum, and steel is considered by historians as one of the most astonishing industrial feats of the 20th century. In the early going, cargo ships often sailed without adequate gun protection. Many had no guns at all. The massive sinkings by the virtually unopposed German U-boats and surface raiders was appalling.
When the torpedo hit, it hit on the starboard side and destroyed the other 2 lifeboats on that side. So we only had 1 lifeboat to put in the water and the 4 10-man life rafts. I was able to get off in the lifeboat, and we pulled away from the ship, and the ship sunk in 12 minutes.
In 1942 alone, German submarines sunk 1,200 Allied ships. Nearly 100 went down off the east coast of the United States. The mammoth oil slicks that were caused by these sinkings would send today's environmentalists into shock.
The rest of the crew weren't able to be picked up. There were 17 men, and they were 19 days in an open lifeboat, and they finally landed in Norway and were eventually captured. Since I was the youngest, I was only 16, and every time they wanted some kind of a guinea pig, they picked on me.
They opened fire, and of course we were caught completely by surprise. And all of that burning oil came down over the after side of the house and just set everything afire. By the time I got out of my room, 2 rooms after me was the last room, fire was just billowing out of this fellow's room. That room was a mass of flames, and I had to get down on my hands and knees to get by. I'd probably been knocked out for a bit, I don't know, but the ship caught fire very quickly, and when I managed to get out on the after deck, there was fire all over the after side, and I couldn't get up to the lifeboats.
With Russia staggering on the brink of defeat to the Germans, the only quick way to get war supplies and food to her was over the top of the Arctic Circle, to the ports of Murmansk and Molotov. It was almost suicidal.
We were the first American prison in Germany, so there was a lot of interest in interrogating us in depth. I don't know what they thought we knew, but I'm sure they knew more than we did. But we were in Wilhelmshaven for about 2 weeks, and we were underwent intense interrogation by the Gestapo every day. If you didn't tell them what they thought you knew, then they'd put you in solitary for a couple of days, bring you back out, and go through the same routine.
At one time, 1 out of 3 ships was being sunk. Survivors on many occasions were given rations by the German submarines and usually pointed in the direction of occupied Norway. If they made it there alive, they were taken prisoner.
We made, there were several of us, three of us that made an attempt to escape. We had all the preparations necessary. We had some civilian clothes, we had maps, and the things we needed to get out of the camp and try to make for the Swiss border. Some English sailor had it in for us, and he found out about it and reported to the Germans. And of course, the Germans came in, and when we fell out for roll call, they kept us out there in the sleet and rain for about 14 hours while they ransacked our room, let us in at 10 o'clock at night, and they dumped out all the food that we had. We had straw sacks for mattresses, and they'd ripped all those open, and it was a pretty big mess. And the three of us, because we were identified by name, we spent 6 weeks in solitary.
One of the most incredible prisoner of war stories concerns merchant mariner Jack Smith. Smith, as an 18-year-old, and two other merchant marine seamen volunteered to accompany an inexperienced Russian crew back to Russia on a cargo ship provided by the United States. They were to be paid by the Russians in American dollars. But when the ship reached the northern port of Murmansk, Smith and his two friends were paid off in worthless Russian rubles. As the three Americans went ashore to complain to the Russian authorities, they were immediately arrested for violating curfew and shipped off to a concentration camp. Smith was quickly put to work unloading boxcars of corpses of men and women and children who didn't survive the trips to the camp. He later made his escape into the snow-covered woods, and after 3 days was miraculously found barely alive by a wandering band of Laplanders. He was then smuggled out of northern Russia, across German-occupied Finland, neutral Sweden, and finally into the hands of the Norwegian resistance. From here, Smith was hid aboard a fishing trawler and delivered to the shores of Scotland. Smith's nightmare ordeal, however, was far from over. He was immediately taken into custody by the British and imprisoned. Being held captive in a concentration hell camp by our Russian allies was horrible enough, but now he was being detained by our British allies as a possible German spy. It seems the British had no knowledge whatsoever of any missing American merchant seamen. Smith finally made his way back to the United States and went back to sea in the North Atlantic convoys, participated in the invasion of Okinawa, and sailed into combat in Korea and Vietnam. As for his two shipmates from the Russian prison camp, one survived the war and the other was never heard from again. Jack Smith died on June 23, 1997. Elsewhere in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, the Japanese were taking their toll on merchant vessels. Ships were being sunk left and right by submarines and surface raiders disguised as fishing boats. They most often took no prisoners. The merchant seamen and their Navy-armed guard gun crews who found refuge in lifeboats and on rafts were machine-gunned or taken aboard and killed. A few miraculously escaped. Such was the case of the SS Jean Nicolette.
Not much we could do about it. And there was a young kid, I think he was about 17, he was up in the bow of the boat. He was the first one that the Japs grabbed. They shot him through the head. And in other words, to warn the rest of us, you know, not to try anything. And they took us one at a time and tied our hands. Then they started coming and picking one guy at a time and taking him back there. And you could hear all the commotion, screams and everything when they were running them through that gauntlet. But they just seemed to go right by me and grab somebody. Every time you raised your head up to see what was going on, you got hit with a rifle butt or something. That went on for, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours. And I don't know how long it was before somebody come along. His name was Walker, and he had a little knife that the Japs had taken. They'd taken all the watches and everything, shoes, everything. And he cut me loose.
The Germans in most cases treated the American merchant seamen and their Navy gun crew prisoners with respect in accordance to the rules of war. It wasn't uncommon, however, for them to take prisoners aboard the U-boats or surface raiders on the Pacific and Indian Ocean and later turn them over to the Japanese.
And about the third day, we heard some noise up on deck, and the guard, we had 2 guards on that ship, came down and got us and brought us up on deck, and there were a group of Japanese officers, and we just lined up, and they took a look at us and decided they were going to take us, and they told us to go get our gear, and we went down on a Japanese landing barge, and that's how we became Japanese prisoners, just like that. So now the Japanese, that was, you know, all we could see was every glint on the shore was a sword knocking off somebody's head. We didn't know what we were into.
The Japanese, whose military code of honor recognized only death in battle as an honorable alternative to victory, were unbelievably brutal to their prisoners.
So when we were leaving Singapore, we rode through Raffles Square. We saw 4 or 5 nude women, decomposed bodies hanging in the square. And we asked him, the interpreter, he said that was a warning to the women in Singapore that if they didn't sleep with the Japanese, that would happen to them.
We had a crazy Japanese lieutenant who was in charge of all prison and internment camps all around Batavia. And he was an absolute nut. He beat his own troops more than he did us. He was just crazy. But he was feared by everyone. There was no, you just didn't really get caught in that guy's eyesight. One of the fellows in my ship one day was walking in the camp, and he didn't see Sony. That was his name, Sony. He didn't see him. When you saw a jump, you had to salute or bow. We all wore hats. We wore hats to bed. We didn't like this bowing. But if you got caught outside without a hat, you had to bow to the people. Well, this fellow didn't see him, and Sony called him over. And, of course, the Japanese, they spoke Japanese, and we didn't. And, hey, give this fellow the business, and this poor fellow, he just didn't know what it was all about. He didn't realize that he hadn't saluted or whatever. So Sony had a belt on with a big brass buckle. He just wrapped it up, and boom, he hit the guy, and he cut him all the way down the side.
Then there was the infamous Philippine Death March. Recorded accounts of this atrocity usually tell how thousands of American, British, Dutch, Philippine, and Australian military prisoners were forced by the Japanese to walk over 1,000 miles to a POW camp. What is little known is that among them were many American merchant marine seamen. Hundreds were murdered on the spot by the Japanese if they stopped or fell from illness or exhaustion. When Wake Island fell to the Japanese in the early days of the war, 5 Americans were picked at random, beheaded, and their bodies thrown into the sea. Conditions at the Japanese prisoner camps were appalling. Thousands of Allied prisoners died from disease, starvation, and brutality.
And when we stayed, after we left Singapore, they put us on this little train, and they stacked us up just like you would stack wood up. We were stacked in this little train. I forget how many to this little train. But if you got sick or you fainted, you couldn't fall because you were packed in so tight. And about once a day, maybe, they would stop the car and let you get off a minute to walk around. And after a while, the people fainted and they messed up in the car. It smelled like a sewer barge after a while. After 5 or 6 days, we got up in the jungle, and they took us off, and we were real weak because we didn't get much to eat. And we had to walk about 30, 40 miles in the jungle up to a place called Kanchanaburi.
There were those who were sent on the nightmarish hell ships as slave laborers for Japan's war factories. They also died by the thousands building a railroad system for the Japanese in Siam and the infamous bridge over the River Kwai.
We had malaria and we had dysentery, and that was very, very, of course, malnutrition, but we didn't have the diphtheria and the strange things that decimated those troops up there. So of a 5,000, and we only had 5,000 people working this railway, and we lost, in 13 months, we lost 700 people. Well, that was a sizable number, but again, nothing compared to what the River Kwai was. Yet we're building the same kind of a railway, the same kind of wooden bridges, the same Japanese soldiers, I mean, they're doing it.
Well, from there we worked on the bridge over the River Kwai for almost 2 years. And that was the worst of all. I mean, they just died like flies up there. The Allied prisoners, they say that over a prisoner died for every tie in the railroad. And most of them were natives. They had natives from little boys, 7 years up to old men working on that thing. And it was speedo to everybody. I mean, they just beat you with bamboo and hit you with a rifle butt just to keep you moving. And if you couldn't move, that was it. They just buried you. And they were just brutal up there. I mean, you know, you would treat a cockroach that walked on your floor better than they treated us.
The Japanese contempt and disregard for their prisoners was exemplified even more when they transported their prisoners in the unmarked hell ships. Many of these ships were being sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines, despite being informed by the International Red Cross in early 1942 that the ships must display special markings.
One of the saddest things I ever saw was when we moved, we were in one of the camps afterwards, and this little one-arm, one-leg Englishman was there, and we knew something was the matter when we came in from the working party. We used to go to work at dark and come back, it was dark. We heard all this hollering and screaming going on and everything, so we knew something was bad. And what had happened was he had made the water in his 55-gallon drum too hot for the Japanese officer. So they were heating the water to boiling, and when it got boiling, everybody had to go around and they threw him in. And those screams, I just never forgot them for years and years and years. They were just pathetic.
One of the merchant marine survivors of the sinking of a Japanese prisoner ship was Eric Kamens. He wound up as a slave laborer in a coal mine. Once he was hung by his heels by the Japanese to cure his congestion.
And the second worst thing happened to me. I was on this burial detail up in the jungle when cholera struck. I've heard of cholera, but I'd never seen it, and I mean, that's brutal. You just, through their bottom, they just go till they die, and they were just dying all over, I mean, by the thousands. And we had to go to these different camps every couple of miles up, and we'd get some wood and lay them all there and burn them. And if you didn't do it, and the stench was terrible, but if you didn't do it, you were gone too. They'd shoot you right on the spot.
They jammed 2,200 prisoners on the after deck and in the after hold. On the foredeck and in the forward hold, they jammed 4,300 natives, young native boys that they had conscripted. So they had 6,500 people on board, plus the Japanese crew, plus the Japanese guards. And she was torpedoed by a British submarine called the HMS Tradewind. The loss of life was enormous. Of the prisoners, I have Dutch publications which list about 1,500 Dutch losses of those 2,200 prisoners, and 4 men from my crew were lost in that, from the American Needle were lost in that sinking, plus other nationalities of which we have no connection. So it's possible that there were only maybe 600 people survived that sinking of those 2,200 prisoners. Of the coolies, they were all lost, a whole 4,300 of them.
Daily food rations in the Japanese camps usually consisted of wormy rice and a cup of kamote vines boiled in water. Those who couldn't work had their rations cut by 30%.
And they gave you a little handful of rice once a day and a little cup of water. I didn't have anything, and an Australian gave me a tin cup, and so they used to put the rice in my hand. I'd eat it out of my hand, but it had weevils and bugs, but we were thankful to get the bugs. That's what I think kept us going. I used to pull green leaves. I think they were hibiscus leaves in the jungle when we were working, and ate those. They gave us diarrhea real bad, but it didn't make much difference.
Rations, the German rations were pretty skimpy. They got a piece of bread a day, maybe a couple of potatoes, and maybe a cup of watery soup. And we really were sustained by Red Cross packages. We didn't get them steady, but once in a while we get a Red Cross package with food, and that, I think, kept us alive.
Medical care was non-existent. One American underwent an appendectomy with no anesthesia or infection-fighting drugs. The Japanese were notorious for removing medicines and drugs from the Red Cross supplies for their own use.
And Rowley got sick in one of the camps, and he had appendicitis. So we had a Australian doctor, and he operated on him, and a Dutch hypnotist put him to sleep. There was nothing, no anesthetics or anything, and they strung a piece of canvas to get some thread, and they sewed him up.
Among the worst camps was the one on the Philippine island of Palawan. With the fear of possible approaching American forces, the Japanese set about murdering more than 100 of the remaining 150 American captives. Occupied prison buildings were set afire, and those trying to escape were machine-gunned. Some of the Americans escaped into the jungle or into the water, and those that were caught were drugged back and buried alive. When the war ended, Americans wanted to get on with their lives. To this day, the Japanese do not accept responsibility for starting the hostilities with their sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, and refuse to consider an official apology for its shocking prisoner of war atrocities.
It was, to me, more of a case of survival. This was it. I call it the art of survival. That's my story of how a young American found himself in a difficult situation, but had the mental attitude and the knowledge and doing things. Chance favors the preferred mind. That's what I'm trying to say. If I hadn't learned Dutch early in the game, I wouldn't have been in charge of the work parties. I would have been lugging the wood.
The big thing is missing in action. They talk, they fly flags about missing in action. All of these guys laying on in the bottom of the sea are missing in action. Nobody ever talks percentage-wise. We probably had the highest rate of missing in action. Their families haven't even got their bodies. They're missing. It's a tragedy.
More than 920 Japanese military personnel were executed for their crimes, while many others, just as guilty for their brutality, escaped with only a few months of imprisonment.
I just tried to forget it all when I got home. It's the only way I could handle it. And you can't forget it, but I tried to put everything behind me.
So the total of our crew in numbers, we lost 11 in the original sinking. We lost 13 in this sinking. We lost 4 in the Junior Maru sinking. And on Sumatra, on this railway, we lost 2 of our people there. So of the original 58 people who left New York, 30 of us came home at the end of the war.
Today, more than half a century later, monuments and shrines have been built in Japan honoring these Japanese as war heroes. The Prime Minister of Japan publicly worshipped at the Yasukuni National Shrine, where many convicted war criminals are honored. And their schools are teaching a different version of the outcome of the war. The war crimes of the Nazi government were heinous, but they rarely involved American prisoners of war. The Germans apologize almost daily for the Nazi government war crimes, and they paid over $52.5 billion to the survivors of the Holocaust. Unlike other branches of the armed forces, the Merchant Marine was 100% volunteers. When a ship went to the bottom, the seamen's pay stopped. When they were taken prisoner by the Germans and the Japanese, they received no pay. Nor were they given special treatment by their captors as civilians.
When the ship went down, all our wages stopped. I didn't have shoes for 3 years. I could walk on a hot stone and nothing would bother me. So a Red Cross worker came up and said, "Would you like a glass of milk?" I said, "I sure would. I haven't had any milk in over 3 years." So I drank the milk. She said, I forget what she said, 50 cents or 60 cents. And I said, "Well, I don't have a penny." I said, "I'll sign for it if you want." She said, "No, I'll pay for it."
When the atom bomb ended the war, the Merchant Marine's enormous contribution toward that victory was all but instantly swept under the rug. Men of the armed forces returned home and were provided a new start with the benefits of the GI Bill. Parades were held, and bronze tablets were erected honoring those who did not return. The city fathers in towns across the country never even bothered to look up the names of those Merchant Marines who gave their lives. Yet, they suffered one of the highest casualty rates of the war. There was no GI Bill waiting for them. The merchant mariner had truly been ignored.
The only compensation was this 5,000. I think the figure was that it was a one-time thing, but no pensions, no nothing like that. It was just loss of life. If you lost your life, you would get this minimum 5,000, and that doesn't even today. You know, that doesn't even bury a person properly. You know.
Following the war, certain groups, both civilian and political, accused the Merchant Marine for having been unpatriotic. The Mariners' request for veterans' benefits were denied. They were also under fire for having possible connections with the Communist Party. The most outspoken about these accusations were popular radio columnists Walter Winchell and Westbrook Pegler. The Red Witch Hunt eventually backfired when notables such as General Dwight Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill praised the U.S. Merchant Marine for their heroic wartime contribution. And General Douglas MacArthur had this to say about the Merchant Marine: "The high caliber of efficiency and the courage they displayed under attack mark their conduct throughout the entire war. I hold no branch in higher esteem than the Merchant Marine services." But following the war, this tribute, including those from Eisenhower and Churchill, was ignored by those in high government circles and with powerful media influence. Their aim was to degrade the Merchant Marine's contribution toward winning the war.
But on our ship, we would not have been able to man all the guns had it not been for the Merchant Marine. They passed ammunition. They even helped man the guns. At the time that we fired the 19 rounds of 4-inch at a German bomber, the gun captain happened to be a Merchant Marine who had served a hitch in the Navy. My hat's off to the merchant seamen. I think that they suffered as much, if not more, than we did. Their mortality rate was second only to the Marine Corps during World War II.
Ironically also, nothing was recorded about the U.S. Navy Armed Guard gun crews who sailed on these cargo ships and gave their lives manning usually obsolete guns against overwhelming odds. They became names on heavy casualty lists and forgotten for more than 50 years. It wasn't until October 1998 that the Navy Armed Guard finally received a congressional commendation, the last members of the armed forces to be honored. When the 50th anniversary of VE Day was observed, television networks ran a number of specials, and major magazines published numerous articles commemorating the event. Nothing was mentioned about the Merchant Marine. And when President Clinton visited the Bitburg War Cemetery, his speech never made a reference once about the Mariners.
When we got into Washington, D.C., the plane landed. They had a military contingent out there to pick the military up off the plane. And there were maybe 4 or 5 Merchant Marine on the plane, and nobody was there to meet us or anything. So somebody offered us a ride, and he took us into Washington, in the city, and I met my wife had come in to meet me from New Jersey. So we got a hotel room for the night, but the government didn't give us anything. They just...
In 1978, 33 years after the war ended, Stanley Wilner made a return trip to Thailand and the bridge over the River Kwai. The invitation was extended to Wilner and other survivors of this bitter episode by their former Japanese captors in an effort to heal the wounds of war. For Wilner, after suffering 3 years of starvation, disease, and witnessing the unspeakable torture and senseless killings of his fellow prisoners, he could not bring himself to forgive. More than 20,000 Allied prisoners of war were slave laborers on this infamous railway of death. Half of them would die. One wonders how all the war's supplies got over to England, how planes and tanks got to Russia, the Mediterranean, and the South Pacific, and how all the troops were moved when no mention is made of the U.S. Merchant Marine and the Navy Armed Guard gun crews who protected them. Merchant Marine historian Ian Miller summed it up best when he wrote this: "The failure for more than 50 years to recognize the World War II United States Merchant Marine and those who sacrificed their lives on burning ships in left forgotten and brutal prisoner of war camps is a black spot on the pages of American history. I grew up taking part in various sports, and I never played on a team where all the players were not honored as equal partners. We never took 2 or 3 men and said they were not good enough to stand up for the trophy. The United States Merchant Marine was part of our winning team during World War II. And Americans are too good a people to see these brave men denied their true place in our remembrance. By virtue of a court decision handed down in 1988, the United States Merchant Marine finally received recognition as veterans of World War II.